For many of us on the side of freedom, we have been consumed by anger and resentment since Varadkar took to the podium in March of 2020, and not because of a virus that was exported from China, but the political response to dealing with it, and indeed the behaviour of our people. The pain suffered through discrimination, emotional blackmail, vilification, and through 2 years of constant harassment and confrontation will never be forgotten. In this video, I will present my thoughts on the tactics employed by our side during the crisis and why I believe we may need a more focused approach in future. I say this as I believe a threat similar to Covid-19 may very well present itself in time again, and I also believe that those in power will be more efficient in realizing their agenda through such a crisis, considering the level of conformity our people seem to be willing to exercise. At this stage, I wish to make clear the following. I have read many of the Dáil debates involving the laws and guidelines around Covid-19, and one thing is abundantly clear to me. The vast majority of our politicians were not only in support of the laws that decimated Irish freedom, but practically fetishized over it. They somehow felt great virtue in what can only be described as slavery, and indeed pursued safety through dictatorship. Even those first meetings in the Dáil, politicians stood up and used their first minutes to express their admiration for the Irish people, who in the early days of the crisis were behaving responsibly without any force or coercion. But as soon as their gratitude was on the record, talk of total control, and at the expense of individual liberty, would follow. A small group of Ireland's most inept and corrupt politicians would decide how millions would be forced to act, and of course, how they would be punished if failing to do so. Make no mistake, those in power utterly despised those of us who did not submit. They spoke about freedom being an obstacle instead of a right, as they made legal discrimination, sentenced our elderly to a lonely demise, and harmed our children. The fascist laws, which our left-leaning population were too stupid to identify, took control of every private business in the country still allowed to operate, and turned the media into a propaganda machine with relentless messaging. How people bought into this madness for so long, I will never know. Imagine our people were told by our government, put this needle into your body, deposit its unknown contents, and we will give you back your freedom. And not only did our people willingly participate, but they weren't even offended by the proposition. I can also say with a high degree of certainty, based on my own experience over the past 2 years, that if mandatory vaccination came to pass in this country, blood would have spilled. I believe those who chose not to submit, for their values and for their children, would have acted in ways spoken about for generations. At this stage, I want to address our government ministers directly. After many months of turning this nation upside down and ruining the lives of so many, Ireland's security forces, unfortunately loyal to you, identified a threat. And although each of you were assigned an armed protection detail, you will never be able to fully appreciate the environment you cultivated through authoritarianism. And I will also say that if I were you, I would be forever thankful for the patience and restraint of those you mistreated. At this stage, I wish to say the following. Those of you who declined the vaccination on principle, who chose to brave the madness at the expense of your sanity for freedom, you have my admiration and gratitude, and I have no doubt that should such a crisis ever befall us again, your actions will be more deliberate, indeed surgical, in defending liberty. But I have learned a valuable lesson out of all of this. During the so-called pandemic, our politicians and our people did not value freedom, self-responsibility, or reason. Ill-conceived good intentions, virtue signalling, and self-praise fed the monster that oppressed us, and each pat on the back received for moving further into the realm of totalitarianism encouraged more immoral behaviour. Those of us on the receiving end of this insanity truly witnessed psychotic levels of madness. Our protests in the streets and indeed the many lobbying campaigns to persuade TDs, were largely ignored. Our political establishment only relinquished what was stolen when they wanted to embrace a separate crisis in order to maximise their unrelenting progress. In considering the ignorance and immorality of those elected, I would like to suggest a more focused approach in future. Should another crisis compel our elected representatives to attack our rights and freedoms again, we must bring dissent to their doors, rob them of their peace and sanctuary as they will rob us. The fear, anger, anxiety, and misery they impose on our families must be applied to them and those they love. Their lives must be made impossibly difficult, as they will make our lives impossibly difficult. If they create another two-tier society in future, they must reside in the tier below. For 2 years our politicians ignored our cries and our suffering when brought to them through civil discourse. I believe they will only listen if we become an imposition on their lives in much the same way they will seek to ruin our own. And be under no illusion, Varadkar, Martin, Ryan, Donnelly, Harris, MacDonald, all of them have moved past the pandemic as if they did nothing wrong. They are utterly detached from the suffering caused and the accountability they deserve. I would suggest that if you decide to pursue freedom and justice, that your conscience be clear of any pity for these people, because the truth is, they didn't express pity for us, and the fines and prison sentences handed down are proof of it. At this stage, I wish to express my gratitude to those who have protested over the last 2 years. Whether you did so by defying the laws, lobbying TDs, or making content for social media. Whether you marched the streets, confronted politicians face to face, or stood outside their homes waiting for answers, your courage and persistence should be recognised. In closing, I wish to say the following. There is clear value in civil discourse, and there is a time and place to utilise this avenue of approach in order to express a desire for change. And while such an approach is preferable, the evidence would suggest that today's leaders will simply ignore. But next time, if our Taoiseach adopts a policy of severe restrictions to deal with a mediocre threat instead of pursuing a response through public trust and freedom, we must target those involved. And while a protest of hundreds, if not thousands, is wonderful to see in front of Dáil Éireann, mark my words, they will be compelled to listen if such a gathering takes place on their doorsteps.